It had been 30 years. 30 long years since the city was founded. 30 years since the storm broke upon the walls of New London. I remember the captain standing there, high up on the scaffold of the great steam generator, watching over us as ice literally fell from the sky above. We had survived under his steely gaze, but now he was gone, and I had succeeded him as steward. As the captain's health had failed, so too had the city's. The people of New London, recognising that a new chapter was soon to dawn, began to find their voices at last. Upon the captain's passing, the tension within the city became almost too much to bear. Coal, the fuel that had kept us alive for 30 years, had kept the heart of New London beating, was very nearly depleted. It was a very real, immediate emergency, on par with the post-storm Outpost 11 crisis, which was the closest the city had come to falling into chaos since the Londoners' revolt. The captain had micromanaged us through everything, accounting for every structure built, every lump of coal, and the employment of each and every individual under his care. 30 years on, and such micromanagement was impossible. The city had grown in size and population to such an extent that each and every city district was like its own New London of old, each requiring its own captain. I believed the old captain had not been able to adapt to this new reality. I, however, would have no misunderstanding of the situation. I felt that in order for New London to survive, it must expand. Physically, you understand. The population had grown to more than 20 times what it had been at the time of the Great Storm. Even with many having been asked to leave the city years before, there still wasn't nearly enough housing. And even if there had been, they'd quickly turned into frozen tombs, as there simply wasn't enough coal. So it stood to reason. New coal deposits must be sought after. We'd already dug through the icy wall of New London Crater, and we knew of a small, shallow coal seam. It wouldn't last long, but it might buy us time to find a longer-term solution. At least in the immediate future, we could turn the generator back on and restore some heat to the city. Literally everything was in painfully short supply, or soon would be. In fact, food would soon become a very real problem. The Hunters Company was effectively disbanded, their balloons mothballed or recycled. There was nothing left to hunt anyway. There was, however, some land that might potentially prove to be quite fertile, under the right artificial environment, of course. Space for more housing would also have to be made, as well as districts built to extract the resources and materials needed to build and maintain it all. A constant, never-ending, vicious circle. With coal now flowing back to the generator, I could at last order it to be reactivated.
Steward appreciates all your adoring letters and will answer personally in due time.
A bulletin from the Stewards, effectively the old captain's small security force, was read out over the voice of New London speakers. It thanked everyone for their kindly worded letters on my behalf. Somewhat strange to me, as I hadn't even seen a single letter addressed to me. But less than an hour after the announcement, a large sack of apparent fan mail was upturned onto the floor of my office by one of my secretaries. The old captain's followers still had their old habits, it seemed. Anyway, over the course of the next 2 months, our expansion program made good progress. Delivering housing and accessing resources. We still had shortages in pretty much everything, but progress was being made. New London had survived on innovation. The older engineers had passed on their skills and knowledge, and it was important to get the new generation of innovators to work. Improving the efficiency of our coal mines so that not a single piece of coal dust would be wasted would have to take priority. The Research Institute, built within one of our new housing districts, was finally complete in July of 1916. My stewardship had begun in January of the same year, 7 critical months having passed before we could even begin looking at a solution to our fuel problem. Nevertheless, more progress had been made to meet the challenges of the future in 7 months than had been made in years prior. But now, I found myself facing a new problem, somewhat unforeseen after 30 years of the captain's rule. Opposing groups wanted their preferred solutions explored, and they were willing to argue quite vehemently for it too. The 2 opposing groups met outside the Research Institute and argued it out. Perhaps they're expecting to pressure the researchers into following one way or the other. Some were even trading insults, and it was only the presence of a small group of stalwart guards that stopped things getting violent. A group within the city, calling themselves the Frostlanders, had been growing in size recently, but they had been remaining somewhat dormant, at least until the captain's death. They wanted us to change our ways, to adapt to a way of life dictated to us by the Frostland. They wanted to expand outwards from the city, outwards into the Frostlands, from where many had come seeking shelter within New London. I'm sure you can see the contradiction here. The New Londoners of the city were only slightly larger in number, but they were people who had put their faith within the city, within the generator. Their vision for the future was to build upon what we already had, rather than stretching out and scratching a living on the ice. And there were of course the stalwarts, who had themselves become something of an extremist subfaction of the New Londoners. But unlike the majority of New Londoners, the stalwarts were far less likely to budge from a chosen position. With them effectively making up the city's security force, I felt it important to keep them on side. And I thought the best way to do that was to make them believe that I was on theirs. Regardless, in the argument over improving the coal mines, I actually felt the New Londoners' stalwart approach better anyway. Using explosives to breach deeper into the coal veins, rather than the more manpower expensive idea of gathering every grain of coal dust and compacting it into a briquette tabled by the Frostlanders. But in order to give with one hand, I had to take away with the other. The city was still short on everything, even suitable shelter. We needed another housing district, but the city coffers had run short. So I sent out a fundraising order to my friends, the New Londoners. And with that, the city had the heat stamps necessary to pay the workers to start building. Heat stamps, by the way, are a form of currency brought into use by the captain years ago. They work exactly as old money used to. People are paid for their work, they pay for goods, and they are taxed to allow the city to provide services. Of course, ordering an on-the-spot additional tax from part of the population would give me few friends amongst that group. But to take from the Frostlanders after so recently discarding their idea for the mines would lead to outright animosity. I'm sure you can see how this balancing act works. But in the end, the funds raised allowed us to build more housing and more mines, which was just as well. Coal usage went up as the temperature went down, and the temperature was dropping. It was October after all, and I know this may seem somewhat disjointed, jumping forward several months at a time, but don't forget, everything being done at this point in New London's history took considerable time. Districts were, as I've said, like smaller versions of New London. They took time to build up, and unlike those distant early days of New London, where every passing day was like a titanic battle for survival, the established working city of New London in 1916 was, most of the time, just a fairly routine, boring city, with an energy crisis looming on the horizon, of course. It was in October, however, that designs for the blasting coal mines were finalised and the workers set to building our first mines. And with its completion in November, we had for now kept the energy crisis at bay. Now a new issue reared its head. The debate back in the summer over what course of action to take had led on to a new debate. Well, not so much a debate really, more an implementation of a decision made by the captain as his health had waned. With the growing of community groups within the city, predominantly the New Londoners and the Frostlanders, the captain had decided to having future matters settled within a city council. That's right. One of the last acts of the captain's tyrannical totalitarian rule had been to hang the mesmerising sweet fruit of democracy tantalisingly close to the upstretched hands of the masses. He had secured an everlasting existence in the minds of all the city's citizens. Many seemed to act as though he had single-handedly delivered them from doom. After his death, many had even stopped referring to him as the captain whenever the man came up in conversations. It was always he. They'd say, "He never let us down. He saved us all." Or, "We were far better off under his leadership." Many seemed to overemphasize the capital H whenever speaking of him. The captain had gained deity status, and by naming me successor as city steward, he had left me to manage over a city made up of diverging communities, complete with a doubtful future. A future that I had to try to deliver with dwindling resources, whilst acting as a kind of hostage constitutional monarch. If a path chosen by the voting delegates failed, it would be blamed on me. With the council hall now built, expanding upon the older propaganda centre that had doubled as Captain's Palace, it was time for the city delegates to hold their first vote. Had I done enough to keep my involuntary position as steward? The delegates' vote would decide.